Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam: The Sands of Time. It's action and adventure in ancient Egypt in this terrific teen time travel romance. Get your copy of E-Steam: The Sands of Time at your favorite online bookseller today. I was watching a video by The Fourth Age where he proposed that we are in a post-continuity comic book industry. And in a post-continuity comic book industry, it is going to be more about telling stories featuring a character rather than having characters have adventures in a shared universe. So, in a post continuity comic book industry, we are going to have these stories which are going to be featured in limited series, and they're going to be in their own continuity where the story has its own beginning, middle, and end, and has no real impact or ramifications on a shared universe. And it's this type of model that would make these comics more accessible to readers and make the characters more accessible because they are not going to be affected by previous stories or future stories today. So when I listened to him propose that concept, it was something that I could agree with because I proposed the exact same thing a couple of years ago when DC Comics launched the New 52. Because when I saw DC Comics launch the New 52, that's when I started to see the whole shared universe story model become completely unsustainable. And I saw, hairline fractures of the shared universe story model becoming unsustainable way back in 1995 when Marvel Comics announced a storyline called The Crossing. Now, this storyline called The Crossing was where Marvel decided to announce that Tony Stark wasn't a hero, he was actually a villain and an agent of Kang. And with this revelation, they wanted to say that Tony Stark was a bad guy from minute one, and that they needed to get a teenage Tony Stark from an alternate universe to replace him because he was evil from the beginning. And when I heard that storyline back in the 1990s, I knew how bad that story was, and I knew how devastating it would be to the Marvel Universe. And it had a disastrous effect on the Marvel Universe because it had come at the same time as the Clone Saga had come, where they had announced that it was Spider-Man who died, not the clone. And both of these stories and several other bad stories that were going on at the time, these had ripple effects throughout the whole Marvel Universe that led to the complete collapse of the Marvel Universe, which happened with Onslaught and eventually was attempted to be fixed with Heroes Reborn. Unfortunately, the damage from the whole Tony Stark being the agent of Kang was never really reconciled in the Marvel Universe because with the whole Heroes Return storyline and the Heroes Reborn storyline, we got Franklin Richards fixing everything with a deus ex machina. So everything as related to Tony Stark was never really resolved, and that had a ripple effect throughout the Marvel Universe that was felt for the next 2 decades. And what happened with the Marvel Universe after Heroes Reborn and Heroes Return was they had a surge in sales when they had these top talents like George Perez, Kurt Busiek, and many others working on Marvel Comics. But once those men finished their runs, what happened was Marvel went into a state of decline because they did not have the talent there that understood how shared universes worked, and even worse, they just did not have the editorial leadership that understood how shared universes worked, or how to set a course in a shared universe, or how to maintain and manage the structure of a shared universe. Because when you're telling stories in a shared universe, you have to understand that every story you tell has an impact not only on past stories, but has an impact on future stories. And the story you're telling right now, what it does, it gives readers an incentive to either start buying old back issues or continue buying new issues. And when you have people making revelations like Tony Stark is an agent of Kang and was a villain, or Steve Rogers was an agent of Hydra, what that does is it derails the character and it derails the series, and it literally stops the series from having any momentum. Because when you have a revelation like that, yes, it is shocking and it's controversial, but what it does is it damages the character's reputation to the point where readers no longer have incentive to continue buying that character's adventures or even believe in the integrity of a shared universe. Because Captain America being revealed to be an agent of Hydra literally destroys the entire structure of the Marvel Universe, because it's something that just can't be reconciled in an organic fashion. And that was something I saw with the whole Franklin Richards ex machina for Heroes Return as related to Tony Stark. It never really resolved the whole issue of Tony Stark being an agent of Kang in an organic fashion, nor did it resolve the issue of the story in a constructive manner where the reader could go back to continue reading that character's adventures without having that question in their minds. And the same thing happened over at DC Comics under the incompetent leadership of Dan Dido. Now, your Dan Dido over at DC Comics in the early 2000s came up with the idea of doing a story called Identity Crisis. And the Identity Crisis story was based on an old DC comic story where the DC superheroes switched their minds with other heroes, and it was supposed to be this big mystery. Unfortunately, because Dan Dido had no publishing experience and no experience as related to storytelling, he allowed the story to go through, and this murder mystery of Sue Dibney wound up derailing the DC universe because many of the concepts he presented could not be resolved or reconciled in an organic fashion that allowed the DC shared universe to flow smoothly and organically. And what happened was, because this story did not really fit organically with the other stories in the shared universe, it wound up derailing the past stories of the DC universe as related to the pre and post crisis DC universe, and it derailed the future comics that came out of DC universe, because most of those stories were efforts to try to fix the problems as related to that story, like these events like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Flashpoint, and because they could not fix any of the problems related to Identity Crisis, what happened was we had Dan Dido decide he wanted to launch this New 52, and what happened with the New 52 was it completely destroyed the DC universe and destroyed the momentum for sales of DC Comics overall. And we could have shared universe models. Unfortunately, the big problem with the shared universe these days is the shared universe model has become completely damaged due to years of mismanagement and editorial incompetence, and this has led to the complete decline of the comic book industry, because with each reboot, what happens is most readers have no incentive to continue buying these stories, and with the reboots coming more and more frequently, what has been happening is readers have just decided to just wait for trade or just wait for the next reboot to wait for the stories they want to read. So the whole idea of having serialized stories in a shared universe, that's a model that is on its way out. And the reason why, again, it's on its way out is due to editorial incompetence and the inability of editors to set a course for the universe, set a course for stories, and take leadership and insist that standards be maintained. Because what we're having right now is we have comic pros whose excesses aren't being checked, and because they're not being checked, what's happening is they're doing things to characters that's leading to these characters not being able to be used by other creators, because what most creators nowadays aren't doing is understanding that when you have a run of comics, another creator has to pick up the baton and continue running the race. So it's like a race where you have these runners, and one writer has to understand that when he finishes his run of stories, he has to leave the character in a condition and a state that that other writer can just pick up and continue writing stories. But we're not seeing that because in today's shared universes, many creators are very selfish, and they do things like mutilate characters, kill supporting characters, and then another writer, when they come on, they have to spend at least 6 to 12 issues undoing all the damage that this other writer has done before they can start doing their runs. And this is why shared universes have many serious problems, because with each reboot, the writers have to spend most of their time undoing what was done in volume 3 or volume 4 to the supporting cast, or things that were done to the character in a previous volume. And then they finally, about issue 12 or 13, they start doing the stories they wanted to do. And we didn't see that back in the 1970s and the 1980s when I got into comics. When I remember looking at my brother's David Michelini, Bob Layton run books, and right after your Bill Mantlo had finished Iron Man, he left the character in a condition that David Michelini could just pick up on the character and begin that storied run. The same thing with Len Wein and Chris Claremont on the X-Men. The X-Men were left in a condition where everybody was intact and the whole series was in pretty much good working condition. So Len Wein and then Chris Claremont could come in and start that storied run on the X-Men. But we're not seeing creators leaving the character in a functional condition so the next writer can come on. And this is what's leading to many shared universe comics just not being able to work, and the shared universe model being able to work in a functional manner. And that's what's led to what the Fourth Age is proposing, a post-continuity comic book universe, because with the continuity so completely damaged, readers have no incentive to go out here and continue buying the books. And as I see it, continuity could work, but it just can't work right now because the universe structures are so damaged due to all the reboots, and it's become more and more confusing for readers to continue to pick up books with all the reboots. So, as I see right now, what the industry needs to do is, in order to get readers back into comics, what they're going to have to do are do things like original graphic novels, standalone books featuring characters where they are not hampered by continuity. Because in things like a Batman White Knight or a story that's just a simple one original graphic novel, we can just do a story featuring the characters and let the readers choose the stories they want to tell. Now, this is something, again, I proposed a couple of years ago on my blog, Shawn James Black Freelance Writer. I proposed the whole original graphic novel model where no one is quote-unquote dead, nothing has happened, and everything in a story is in a single self-contained volume. And writers could just tell stories from different eras, like, for example, if they wanted to tell a story during the Perez era Avengers, they could tell a story in that era, or they could tell a Justice Society story featuring the Justice Society in the Golden Age, or they could tell a Superman story set during the Silver Age, or they could just tell a story that's a basic Superman story, and it's all contained in one volume. And in that one volume, everything happens in that volume without being affected by a shared universe. There is no number 2 issue, there is no to be continued. Everything is contained in that one volume, and readers pick the stories they want to read featuring their favorite characters, and they don't have to deal with the baggage of continuity. And with that model, we could see the readers choosing the stories they want to see and choosing the stories they want to see more of. So instead of a shared universe, we'd have stories featuring people's favorite characters, and we would be able to read adventures featuring said characters in these stories. So instead of having to deal, or writer having to deal with continuity, what they would have to do is just do their basic research on a character's history, events in that character's history during that time period, and just tell the story they want to tell. Or if they didn't even want to even deal with any of that past history, just read the origin and just do what they want. So they would be able to tell, say, something like a Batman story, and it would just be a Batman story with the base history of the character, but it would be something that stays true to the spirit of the character, but they would not be bogged down by all of that continuity. And with post-continuity stories, that all a reader has to do is just pick the books that they want, read the characters they like, and if they don't like a story, they don't have to read that one because it has no impact on other stories. Now, I know that the shared universe model is capable of working, and I use a shared universe model right now on my SJS Direct books, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books like The Temptation of John Haynes. So I know that the shared universe model can work. But in order for a shared universe model to work, you need to have an editor in charge who has a vision and an editor who can give guidance to writers and let them know that they cannot go into excesses because you have to maintain this character's integrity so that other writers can use them later on in their stories. And this is the big problem with continuity, is that many of the writers, they either see continuity as a crutch or they have no understanding of how to make continuity work. And that's why we are in a post-continuity comic book industry, because many people just don't understand how to make the mechanics of it work in a constructive manner. In order for a shared universe to work, again, you need to understand how each story affects another story, and how each action of a character has an equal and opposite reaction, and how that reaction is affected by the reader. The big problem is that there is no real leadership in editorial, and that's why the shared universe has fallen completely apart. And that's why the comic book industry, in order to survive, I believe, like the Fourth Age proposed, is going to have to adapt by going into this post-continuity model, where it becomes more about stories and telling stories that readers can get into, and making those stories the way that readers can get into comics. So I believe it's just time for the whole shared universe model to go, because it just doesn't work anymore, because the damage has been done. When you look at stories like Secret Empire and The Crossing, they have damaged the characters to the point where they have become irreparable. And when you have a story like that, you cannot just reboot out of it and then go back to business as usual, because you cannot reconcile these concepts you presented in an organic fashion. And when you can't reconcile the concepts in people's minds organically, what they do is they no longer see that character in the exact same way. And I've heard people say that about Captain America, and that's the way I felt about Iron Man. Iron Man was one of my favorite characters in the Marvel Universe, and after The Crossing, I never saw the character in the exact same way. And it's hard to reconcile these concepts when you make these revelations, because they literally damage people's perception of the character. And when you damage people's perception of the character, they have no longer a reason to continue reading that character's adventures. And the damage to both the DC and the Marvel Universe is so extensive at this point, due to all of these reboots, that at this point, the only way to save many of these characters is with a post-continuity model, where people just read the stories of their favorite characters, and they form relationships with the characters in these stories. And if they like what they've read in that one story, they can always ask the writer to write more, and make more stories that are single and self-contained. And in those single self-contained stories, they can read the stories they want without having to pick up back issues if they don't want to. If you want to try some of my SJS Direct Universe titles, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon or my PayPal by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.